Have you ever wondered how a group of generals tried to change the course of history? In a single moment, they were closer than ever to killing one of the most dangerous men in the world. But did they succeed? Would the war have ended sooner? The decisions, the small moves, the moment of the explosion, every second could have changed the fate of millions. We'll show you every detail, every conversation, every tense moment, every step that tried to shape the world's destiny. But the question, you'll only get the answer by watching till the end. Keep watching the video to find out what happened. And now let's start the video. Berlin, summer 1944. A closed meeting room, thick curtains, and heavy air, like even the words were afraid to come out. General Ludwig Beck stood in front of a map of Europe and said calmly that they were not there to complain, they were there to decide. He paused, then said the war was already lost, and the only thing left was how many more people would die. One of the officers replied that they had said this before, and every time they backed down. Beck answered that this time was different. The Russians were moving closer to Berlin, the Allies had landed in France, and Hitler refused any retreat. Someone said that what they were talking about was open rebellion. The reply came fast. The real rebellion was letting the country burn while they stood and watched. Silence filled the room. Then the plan was mentioned for the first time. Valkyrie, an official emergency plan already signed by Hitler himself. But this time, the emergency wouldn't come from the people. It would come from the top. At that moment, the door opened. A wounded officer walked in, missing his left, standing with strange confidence. It was Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was asked if he understood what he was stepping into. He said he did, and if he didn't understand the danger, he wouldn't have entered the room. Someone said killing Hitler was treason. He answered that treason was letting him live and continue what he was doing. Another officer asked what would happen if they failed. Stauffenberg said they might die, but if they didn't try, every man in that room would be responsible for what came next. They asked who could get close to Hitler without being searched. No one spoke. Then Stauffenberg said simply that he attended the meetings, always carried a bag, and no one searched a wounded officer. Someone warned that if the plan failed, it wouldn't just fail quietly, it would end in blood. The answer came back that the blood was already flowing. People just refused to admit it. In the end, it was made clear that once they stepped in, there was no turning back. You either succeed or you're arrested and executed. Everyone in the room understood that the decision was already made. From that moment on, no one could ever say, "I didn't know." The next day, Stauffenberg stood outside the High Command building. Security was tight, but routine. A wounded officer, high rank, clean record. No reason for suspicion. A guard glanced at the bag and casually asked if the meeting would take long. Stauffenberg said he didn't know, probably like always. The guard let him through. Inside, he ran into General Friedrich Fromm. Fromm looked at him briefly and asked if he was ready to present the reports himself. Stauffenberg said yes, and that he had direct instructions. Fromm hesitated like he wanted to say something, then stopped and simply said, "Be careful." That word stayed with him. The meeting room was wide, but the chairs were close together. The generals were seated, papers in front of them. The only sound was pages turning. Then Hitler entered. Everyone stood. The salute echoed at the same time. Hitler sat down and gestured for them to sit. The discussion started with the Eastern Front. Orders, refused retreats, raised voice, clear anger. Stauffenberg stood near the table, the bag resting by his leg. He opened it quietly, without anyone noticing. A general asked about fuel shortages. Hitler exploded, calling it cowardice, saying the army must fight to the last man. At that moment, Stauffenberg felt the timing was perfect. His single hand moved with difficulty, but his mind was steady. Suddenly, an aide stepped in and whispered in Hitler's ear. Hitler's expression changed. He said the meeting would be shortened and continued in another room with better ventilation. That was the problem. The new room was lighter, with open windows. The bomb needed a closed space. Stauffenberg tried to move the bag closer to Hitler, but another officer nudged it aside unintentionally while passing. The bag shifted. Seconds passed. Stauffenberg asked permission to leave for an urgent call. Hitler approved without looking at him. He left. As he walked down the hallway, he heard light laughter from inside the room. Normal laughter. Not the laughter of men about to die. He stopped for a moment, then kept walking. Minutes later, he learned the meeting had ended without any explosion. The bomb was never activated. He returned to Berlin in silence. Inside the car, no one spoke. Someone finally asked, "Why?" He answered calmly, "The conditions changed." The man said the chance was gone. Stauffenberg replied, "No, this is just the beginning." That night, they met again. Same faces, same room. They said the attempt had failed. One officer slammed his hand on the table and said luck wouldn't stay with them forever. Stauffenberg said, "Luck has nothing to do with it. We need a clearer opportunity and a closed room." Someone asked, "When?" He answered, "Soon, very soon." Before the meeting ended, one officer said something no one forgot. "If Hitler suspects even one of us, we won't get another chance." Silence followed. Everyone knew the countdown had begun. Berlin, 2 days after the failed attempt. The air inside the High Command building was tense. Everyone knew suspicion was creeping in, and all eyes were watching. Stauffenberg walked into the room. The generals were sitting like always, papers in front of them, but everyone was focused on what he had to say. General Fromm was the first to speak. "I heard the attempt failed." Stauffenberg answered calmly, "Not a failure, just the circumstances changed." Without raising his voice, everyone in the room understood the message. There's a second chance, but it has to be done more carefully. One of the officers asked, "When do we try again?" He said, "Soon, but this time we have to make sure everything's perfect. No surprises." At that moment, a new officer entered the room, a young man named Heinz Bohm. He asked immediately, "I heard about Valkyrie. Is it real?" Stauffenberg looked at him. "Yes, it's real. Everything is tied to it, but we have to keep it completely secret." Bohm nodded. "Got it. No one knows anything." The plan started to take shape. Stauffenberg explained, "Hitler attends meetings every day. Someone needs to get close to him without being searched. The bomb has to be in a closed room away from ventilation." One of the generals said, "What if someone gets caught?" Stauffenberg replied, "We're all in the same boat. Everyone knows the risk." The generals exchanged glances. Everyone understood the danger. Fromm asked, "Who will go in the room?" Stauffenberg said, "Me. Definitely me." Another officer asked, "What if it fails?" He answered, "We try again. No time to waste." After the meeting, everyone left the room. Stauffenberg paused for a moment, looked at the generals' faces, saw the tension, and whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning. Soon, Hitler will see the consequences of his actions." Berlin, a day later. Everyone knew this second chance had to be precise. The generals were in a small room, papers open, faces tense. Stauffenberg started, "Hitler will attend the meeting tomorrow at 12. The bomb will be with me, and no one can know." Fromm spoke quietly. "You're sure you can get in without being noticed?" Stauffenberg replied, "Yeah, every time I attended the meetings, no one searched me." One officer asked nervously, "What if something goes wrong?" Stauffenberg looked at him. "Everyone here understands the risk. Nothing happens without calculation." At the same time, Bohm entered again. He asked cautiously, "What's the final plan?" Stauffenberg explained quickly, "The bomb will be in my bag. Hitler will be in a small closed room. Anything that reduces the chance of being discovered. I leave the meeting right before the explosion." Nodded. "Got it. No one knows?" "No one." The next day, Stauffenberg stood outside the High Command building. Tense atmosphere. Heavy security. Every step calculated. Inside, he saw Hitler standing with the generals, all eyes focused on the leader. One officer asked about the latest reports. Stauffenberg handed the files quickly, without raising his voice. The clock was near the right time. He opened his bag quietly, the bomb ready. But an aide suddenly came in and whispered to Hitler, who then moved to another room with better ventilation. Stauffenberg tried to move the bag closer, but an officer brushed past and nudged it slightly. The bomb didn't go off. Stauffenberg felt frustrated, but he knew the opportunity wasn't gone. After leaving the room, he stopped in the hallway. He heard light laughter from inside, normal laughter, not the laughter of men about to die. He smiled to himself and said, "This is just the beginning. Next time it'll be calculated better." Back in the room with the generals, he said, "This attempt didn't succeed, but the plan continues. Everyone here knows the stakes." One officer asked, "When's the next attempt?" He said, "Very soon." This time, no chance for luck. Before ending the meeting, one officer said something everyone remembered. "If Hitler suspects any of us, we won't get another chance." Silence followed. Everyone knew the countdown had begun. Morning, July 20th, 1944. The day started like any other, and that was the scariest part. Stauffenberg woke up early, put on his uniform, and set the bag by the door. No talking. What had to be done that day was already decided. Before leaving, an officer asked if he needed anything. He said, "No, everything's fine." On the plane to Hitler's headquarters, he sat quietly. The guy with him tried small talk about the weather. He replied with a few words, and that was it. The clock was moving painfully slow. At the headquarters, security checks were routine. Someone glanced at the bag, another at his papers. No one stopped him. He went to a side room before the meeting, closed the door, pulled out the bomb. His one hand moved slowly, but this time, no hesitation. He broke the capsule. He heard the soft click. The bomb was armed. He put it in the bag and closed it. He entered the meeting room. Hitler was standing by the table, pointing at a map, generals around him. Stauffenberg placed the bag under the table, close to Hitler's leg. He spoke for a few seconds about reports, then said he needed to step out for an urgent call. Hitler nodded without looking at him. The meeting continued. Stauffenberg left quietly. No running, no glancing back. Seconds later, the explosion shook the room, a huge sound. Tables overturned, glass shattered, People fell. Smoke filled the room. Outside, Stauffenberg heard it. He stopped for a moment, then quietly said, "Done." He got into the car and headed for the airport. In Berlin, Ulbricht was waiting for news. The phone rang. Stauffenberg's voice, "Hitler's dead." Ulbricht paused for a moment, then said, "Start Valkyrie." Orders were followed. Emergency units moved, party leaders arrested, key buildings secured. Berlin was changing right in front of them. But at the same time, in the headquarters, the smoke started clearing. Hitler was standing, injured, clothes torn, ear bleeding, but alive. Someone approached him. "The Führer, are you okay?" Hitler answered quietly but angrily, "I'm alive." And in that moment, history itself was shifting. In Berlin, rumors started to mix. Some said Hitler was dead, others said he was alive. Phones rang and hung up, orders got scrambled. Time became the enemy. Stauffenberg reached Berlin, sure the plan had worked. He entered the building and said confidently, "Hitler's dead. No time to waste." But doubt was starting to appear on faces. Someone said, "No official confirmation." Another said, "The radio is still broadcasting his speeches." Silence fell again. The moment that was supposed to end the war started turning into a nightmare. After the explosion, Berlin was chaos. Phones ringing nonstop, generals unsure who was dead and who was alive. Stauffenberg stood in the headquarters, eyes on the clock, waiting for official news. Fromm approached him. "Who's in control now?" Stauffenberg replied confidently, "Special units are moving, key locations are secured." Suddenly, the news changed. People reported dead were alive. Hitler had survived, injured, clothes torn, but standing, eyes sharp, face full of anger. Ulbricht was the first to notice. "He's alive." Stauffenberg felt the ground slipping beneath him. He said to himself, "This is the beginning of the end." Hitler started giving direct orders. First, arrest anyone connected to the plot immediately. The generals froze, calculating every move. One officer asked, "Where do we start?" Hitler looked at him. "Anyone who thinks they're safe, they're not." In the districts, officers started rounding up the responsible. Bohm was the first caught, just on suspicion. They removed him from service and put him in a small cell. Stauffenberg tried to coordinate with the team, but orders were canceled, soldiers hesitated, unsure who to obey. Ulbricht tried to maintain control. "Everyone follow the plan." One officer replied, "Who's going to believe us now?" Everyone knew Hitler was alive. The plan had failed. Hitler came out himself, saw his officers, smiled with anger and hatred. He said loudly, "Any traitor will know the meaning of the word." Arrests escalated quickly. Army offices were searched. Anyone who thought they were safe suddenly disappeared behind bars. Stauffenberg tried to hide but didn't know who knew or who was watching. Bohm was moved to a cell, looking at the soldiers. One said, "This is the end of us." Bohm replied, "No, we tried. That's all we could do." In Berlin, people gathered around headquarters. Orders and favors mixed up. Even those in the plot started doubting each other. Stauffenberg stood in front of the generals. "Everyone here knows the risk. One wrong step could cost us our lives." But the truth became clear. Hitler is alive. Valkyrie has failed. The next hours were going to be the hardest. Berlin, hours after the failed explosion. The headquarters was in chaos and confusion. Generals stood at their offices, everyone calculating their next move. No one knew who was alive or dead. Stauffenberg stood apart, eyes focused on every movement. One officer asked him, "What's the next step now?" Stauffenberg replied calmly, "Secure all key locations and stop any resistance. But it all depends on knowing who's with us and who's against us." At the same moment, Hitler appeared suddenly in the hallway. All eyes turned to him, his face full of anger and hatred, but clearly alive. One officer asked, "The Führer, are you okay?" Hitler replied quietly but threateningly, "I'm alive, and any traitor will pay the price." Orders started coming directly from Hitler. First, arrest anyone connected to the plot immediately. The generals froze. Everyone understood that the plan was gone. Bohm was the first caught, just on suspicion. They moved fast. Everyone involved started being watched and arrested. Stauffenberg tried to communicate with the rest of the team, but all orders were canceled. Soldiers hesitated, unsure who to obey. Ulbricht tried to maintain control. "Everyone, follow the plan." One officer replied, "Who's going to believe us now?" Everyone knew Hitler was alive. Valkyrie had failed. Hitler entered the meeting room, looked at his officers, and smiled a smile full of anger and hate. He said loudly, "Any traitor will know the meaning of that word." Arrests escalated quickly. Army offices were searched. Those who thought they were safe suddenly disappeared behind bars. Stauffenberg tried to hide, but didn't know who was watching his steps. Bohm was moved to a cell, seeing the soldiers around him. One said, "This is the end of us." Bohm replied, "No, we tried. That's all we could do." In Berlin, people gathered around the headquarters. Orders and favors mixed up. Even those in the plot began doubting each other. Stauffenberg stood in front of the generals. "Everyone here knows the risk. One wrong step could cost our lives." The truth was clear. Hitler is alive. Valkyrie has failed. The next hours were going to be the hardest. Berlin, a day after the direct confrontation with Hitler. The headquarters was in a state of terror. Arrests and executions had started. Everyone knew time was against them. Bohm, in his cell, stood silently. One soldier asked him, "Do you know who's next?" Bohm replied calmly, "Doesn't matter. We tried. That's all we could do." Stauffenberg tried to contact the remaining team, but all lines were cut. Soldiers hesitated. No clear orders. Ulbricht tried to keep control. "Focus on saving lives. See who can survive." One officer replied, "Who can survive now? Everything's exposed." The executions began. Generals involved in the plot were gathered in one room. Hitler sent direct orders. Any traitor will be tried immediately. Any attempt to escape will be met with death. One officer asked, "What's the last message we can send?" Stauffenberg replied, "Show courage, even if the end is tragic." In other headquarters, news spread fast. Soldiers saw who was alive and who was dead. Suspicion entered hearts. Civilian employees tried to hide, but nowhere was safe. Stauffenberg stood in front of the generals, focused. "One wrong step and our lives are gone. Everyone who tried knows we did all we could." Ulbricht tried to calm the team. "No turning back now, but at least we can protect each other." One officer replied, "Who's going to believe us? Everything's exposed." Hitler himself began monitoring the plot's movements. Arrests accelerated. The areas the team had controlled returned under his authority quickly. Everyone knew the moment they were waiting for was gone. Stauffenberg paused, hand on his chest, looked at the generals around him. He whispered softly to himself, "We tried. That's all we could do." What happened next was the beginning of the end. Complete collapse of the plot team. Surviving generals started hiding Berlin, fully returned under Hitler's control. Berlin after the collapse of the plot. The city was slowly returning under Hitler's full control. But in Stauffenberg's mind, one question dominated. What if the plot had succeeded? He stood alone in the room, hand on his chest, eyes on the map. He said to himself, if the bomb had gone off in the right place, Hitler would be finished. Germany would have changed. The whole world would have changed. Imagine, if the plot had succeeded, the surviving generals would control the key headquarters. Bohm alive, Stauffenberg alive, Ulbricht alive. Orders would have changed, people would have breathed freely. But reality was different. Ulbricht entered the room, face full of fear. Everything's lost. Stauffenberg replied, "Not everything. We tried, but circumstances were against us." In the streets, people felt panic. Arrests continued. Even ordinary soldiers started doubting each other. Civilian staff tried to hide. Nowhere was safe. Stauffenberg sat with the remaining team, everyone silent. One officer said, "We failed. Hitler is alive. Everything's gone." Stauffenberg shook his head. "No, we tried. That's all we could do." At that moment, some surviving generals imagined the scenario if the plot had worked. Hitler gone, Germany controlled by a new leadership, the war could end faster. But all of this was just imagination. The reality was harsh. Hitler alive, and what happened didn't match expectations. Those who tried to survive started hiding. Bohm in his cell, Stauffenberg in his place, Ulbricht thinking of the next move. Stauffenberg stood in front of the generals. Life goes on, but what happened will remain a mark in history. Everyone knows they tried, and that's what matters. Meanwhile, Hitler tightened his grip. Orders reached every headquarters, any traitor caught. Those who tried to escape disappeared. Berlin fully returned under his control. Imagination ended, reality took over. The plot failed. The leaders who tried barely survived. Hitler remained at the top, Berlin. The days after the plot. All headquarters under Hitler's control, streets full of soldiers and police. Those involved in the plot were arrested one by one. Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, and the rest of the team were gathered in their cells. Time pressed on them. Bohm stood silently, staring at the floor. One soldier said, "Today, it will be the end." Stauffenberg replied calmly, "Maybe, but at least we tried." In the military courtroom, judges stood, Hitler watching from afar with sharp eyes. The captured officers were brought forward. Those who tried to escape vanished. Stauffenberg stood before the judges, voice steady. "All we did was to stop the war, stop the massacres, free our country from tyranny." The judges didn't respond, but their eyes were full of fear. Hitler heard the words from afar. A smile full of anger and hatred appeared on his face. He said loudly, "Any traitor will be dealt with. Anyone thinking they're above the law, wrong." Executions were set for those involved. Cells were filled with tension. Everyone knew their fate. Bohm looked at Stauffenberg. "At least we tried." Stauffenberg nodded. "Yeah, that's all we could do." On the last day, the psychological weight was clear on everyone. Their steps were silent, but their minds full of fear, regret, courage. Stauffenberg entered the final hall. He smiled quietly to himself. "We tried. Even if we failed, it's part of history." In front of the soldiers, the sentence was carried out. Those who tried to change the course of history ended tragically. Berlin returned fully under Hitler's control. But the mark of the plot remained in history, a reminder that courage tried, even if it failed. The historical lesson was clear. Tyranny can defy everything. Courage sometimes isn't enough if circumstances are against you. History remembers those who tried to change it.